This is a lecture on literature, so I'm going to begin with a story. It isn't my story. It is one borrowed from the pages of Victor Hugo's great masterpiece, Notre Dame de Paris, the story of Paquette Chantefleury. For these few opening minutes, just sit back and listen. Feel free to close your eyes even, and let your imaginations put paint to what is described by Hugo. Paquette Chantefleury was a beautiful girl who came from an honest family, but her father died when she was a mere child. Her mother was unfit to earn a living, and the winters were bitter cold. So, her beauty being her most valuable asset, she was forced to turn to prostitution. 5 years later, her mother had died, and her beauty had faded. She had no bread in her cupboard and no one left to love. She was alone in the world, pointed at, hooted after in the street, beaten by the police, mocked by little ragged boys. In her shame and disgrace, despised by all, she gave herself up to longing for a child and prayed that God would give her one. One beautiful day, she was blessed with a little girl, and Paquette worshipped her. She was so happy she grew handsome again, and she revived her old iniquitous trade so that she might buy her daughter all the most extravagant finery. The baby's little pink feet were a source of particular and endless wonder, and she made for her a pair of tiny satin shoes embroidered with intricate stitches. She, quote, would gladly have spent her life on her knees, putting the shoes on and off those feet as if they had been those of an infant Jesus, unquote. One day, a band of gypsies roamed into her town and camped on a hill on its outskirts and offered to tell people's fortunes. These fortunes, which inclined to the favorable and flattering, became all the rage, and mothers flocked to the gypsies for the opportunity to learn their precious child would become captain, pope, or emperor. Paquette, too, was seized by curiosity and vanity, and was gratified when the gypsies admired her child's beauty and foretold that she would one day be a queen. Eager to relate her good fortune to the neighbors, Paquette left her sleeping baby briefly unattended. When she returned, the child was gone, and nothing was left behind but one of her dainty pink shoes. Paquette flew down the stairs and into the streets, desperately seeking her child and wildly crying for information about her whereabouts. During her absence, a neighbor saw 2 gypsy women carry a bundle into her room and leave it there. But, flying into the room, Paquette found that instead of her dear child, there was in her place a hideous, blind, lame, one-eyed monster. That child monster, incidentally, was Quasimodo. The next day, Paquette received with mute horror the news that 2 leagues away, someone had found the remains of a fire, some ribbons that had belonged to her daughter, and drops of blood. 2 days later, Paquette disappeared, and the people of her village assumed she had drowned herself. 3 centuries prior, a Madame Roland, in deep mourning for her father who had died on a crusade, hewed a cell into a tower wall, shut herself up in it forever, and gifted her property to God and the poor. At her death, she bequeathed this cell to, quote, all afflicted women, mothers, widows, or daughters, who had great need to pray for others or themselves, and who wished to bury themselves alive in token of their great grief or great penitence, unquote. Paquette had not drowned herself, but had spent all her remaining days in that cell, kneeling in worship before the little pink shoe. I shared that story for 2 reasons. Here's the first. After rending our hearts with this sorrowful tale, Hugo then tells us the response of the crowds who pass by this poor woman's cell day after day. They regard her with indifference, and they refer to her dismissively as the old recluse. Hugo then says, quote, "People saw things in this way then, without metaphysics, without exaggeration, without magnifying glass, with the naked eye. The microscope had not been invented yet, either for material or for spiritual things," unquote. Without great literature, we run the risk of living our lives like that indifferent crowd, of looking at things only with the naked eye, of failing to see beyond the surface of our experiences to their spiritual significance. But Hugo and great artists like him help us to develop a more penetrating perception. Great literature is a spiritual microscope that allows us to examine life minutely and marvel at that which had previously gone unobserved. Or a telescope that lets us take in grand, new, and distant vistas in a single glance. Or a stethoscope that gives us access to the very heart of life and allows us to know its pulses. All of these metaphors work because art gives us the power to go beyond the barriers of our ordinary perception and to see more. Why that matters and how it works will be the theme of this lecture. But for now, I will just say that to see more means to see within our everyday experiences a connection to high ideals. That brings me to the second reason I shared this story. Hugo's description of the indifferent crowd and their lack of a spiritual microscope points to the problem of a spiritually barren life. But the poignant story of Paquette, and indeed every other element of this monumental novel, provides us with the solution. I hope you were moved by Paquette's story, as I was. In the context of the novel as a whole, I can promise you it is far more moving still. What have we gained from that experience? How has it helped us in our own personal quests for a life of meaning? To answer that question, let's first look at what Hugo sought to accomplish with Paquette's story and how he accomplished it. For the purposes of his plot and his larger theme, Hugo needed to evoke in us a tender sympathy for Paquette's life of struggle, to make us understand the worshipful adoration she felt for this little girl on whom all her happiness depended, and to have us feel deeply the life-destroying devastation of her loss. To accomplish that, he's taken the abstractions of maternal devotion and human suffering and condensed them into a story that lays bare the very soul of both. He has told not the story of Paquette, with all the trivia, varia, contradictions, and complications that an ordinary life entails, but the story of a mother's love and of her loss. And because of that, because it is a story stripped of all distractions and showcasing values so elemental to the human experience, we feel that love and that loss intensely. Consider the difference between the concepts of motherhood or mourning discussed abstractly, and then consider the image of an emaciated, wan, wrinkled old woman in sackcloth, crouched upon the icy cold floor with her head upon her knees, appearing neither to suffer, to feel, nor even to breathe, and staring always with a serious and fixed expression at a little pink shoe. After we read this story, we are changed, and the glimpses of maternity that we see scattered across our own lives take on a new glow. those of you who have babies or have had babies, will you ever again be able to see or recall in the same way their tiny shoes or their little pink feet? Great novelists tell stories that, to borrow a phrase from Alan Bloom, leave echoes in the human soul, and that alter the way we experience our lives thereafter. I fear I might be accused of hyperbole if I say that bearing witness to Paquette's story makes me a better mother and a better person. But I mean it. The scale of her love and the scope of her tragedy stretch the limits of my own spirit and condition me to see the spiritual significance in the everyday moments of my existence. It isn't that this one story on its own can have that effect, but taken together with countless other stories, offering countless other insights on countless other themes, it can. Great literature is soul-forming. Now, I called this talk Literature and the Quest for Meaning. Typically, if you hear someone today lament the absence of meaning, they usually blame it first on our having abandoned the religious and cultural traditions that give our lives a higher purpose, and second, on our having embraced materialism. I'm sure it won't surprise you that I see it a little bit differently. It is because we today are free from the burdens of a legacy of oppressive customs and beliefs, and because we today enjoy material conditions of unprecedented safety, comfort, freedom, abundance, and long life, that we have a better opportunity than ever before in the history of mankind to live lives full of personal meaning. Our lives belong to us, and we have the means of doing just about anything we want with them. But to live a life of true fulfillment, we have to think deeply, have to even be capable of thinking deeply about what that is. The grain of truth, I think, in the conventional complaints about our meaning-barren lives is that throwing out past dogmas about morality and culture can leave something of a spiritual void. Hallowed traditions and sacred texts may no longer be our source for answers about what constitutes a good life, but we still have to engage very, very seriously with the questions. Questions like, who am I, and who do I want to be? Whom should I admire, and whom abhor? What's worth fighting for, or fighting against? What kind of relationships do I want, and how do I achieve them? A fulfilled life comes as a thoughtful answer to these and many, many more weighty questions. And literature is one of our greatest sources for not just answers, but for the questions themselves. Now, the particular tale I started with today is a tragic one. A story does not, of course, have to be sorrowful to be soul-expanding. What does it need to be? Great literature deals with abstract themes that get to the heart of human experience. It presents those themes in a form so distilled and condensed that it lays them bare. Because these vital insights are captured in an intensely focused story, they awaken in us powerful emotions. And thereafter, we view our own lives through the focusing lens of these insights. We see more clearly, and we feel more strongly. That's important, so I'm going to say it briefly again. Great literature deals with abstract themes that go to the heart of human experience. It presents them in a form that lays them bare. The form of those distilled and condensed insights awakens powerful emotions in us, and thereafter, we view our own lives through their focusing lens. Literature makes us spiritually ambitious. It inspires us to high ideals, and it primes us to see the connection of those ideals to our own everyday lives. If that isn't clear yet, I hope it will be, or at least more so, because I want to spend the rest of our time together talking about the many ways that literature can inspire and inform our personal quests for meaning, and illustrating that inspiration with more stories. A few years ago, in the midst of reading Victor Hugo's 93, one of my 8th grade students slammed the book down and declared, tongue-in-cheek, "I am a terrible person." When taken aback, I said, "Why?" She said, "Just look at these people." What she was really saying, of course, though she opted for a backhanded and humorous form, was, "I revere these characters, and they inspire me to make more of myself." Literature gives us heroes. It gives us men and women with stylized souls who exemplify virtue and dramatize the extent of human possibility. They become our moral standard bearers, leading the way to a life fulfilled. In The Closing of the American Mind, Alan Bloom talks about the decline in reading among students that he observed over his years as a professor. As a consequence of our failing educational system, by the late 60s, he says, students had lost the practice of and the taste for reading, and no longer turned to the printed word for counsel, inspiration, or joy. He laments of his students in the 80s, quote, "As it now stands, they have powerful images for what a perfect body is and pursue it incessantly. But deprived of literary guidance, they no longer have any image of the perfect soul, and hence do not long to have one. They do not even imagine that there is such a thing," unquote. And he asserts strongly that, quote, "Idealism as it is commonly conceived should have primacy in an education, for man is a being who must take his orientation by his possible perfection," unquote. My student was taking her orientation from 93, and no wonder, since among countless other characters, it features Radub. We are first introduced to Radub as he and a small battalion of soldiers for the French Republic are cautiously making their way through a dangerous forest, expecting at any moment, around any corner, to be ambushed. When, suddenly, they hear the sound of breathing in the middle of a thicket, they aim their guns, approach on tiptoe, pull back the underbrush, and discover a mother suckling a baby at her breast, while the blonde heads of 2 sleeping children rest on her lap. Radub, a sergeant described as having a rough face, bristling mustache, and 2 glowing coals for eyes, is still on guard, and fearful she might be a spy. So he questions her. "Do you have a house? Why aren't you in your house?" "Because they burned it." "Where have you come from? Where are you going? Who are you?" "We are people who are running away." "Which party do you belong to? Are you blues? Are you whites? Who are you with?" "I'm with my children." "And what does your husband do, madam? What has become of him?" "Nothing has become of him, because they killed him." "Who killed your husband? Was it a blue? Was it a white?" "It was a bullet." Discovering that this nursing mother has been surviving off wild blackberries and fern shoots, Radub grimaces and then takes a piece of ration bread from his pocket and hands it to her. When she breaks it in 2 pieces and gives them to her children, he grumbles that she didn't keep any for herself. A soldier says, "Because she's not hungry," and Radub corrects him, "Because she's a mother." He stands gazing upon them, contemplating the misery of their orphanhood, flight, solitude, and hunger, And then we are told, quote, "The little girl left her mother's breast, gently turned her head, looked with her pretty blue eyes at that formidable, tawny, bristling face leaning over her, and began to smile." The sergeant straightened up. A big tear rolled down his cheek and stopped at the end of his mustache, looking like a pearl, unquote. I'd like a portrait of that moment, the sergeant with that mustache and that pearl. A moment later, Radub raises his voice to the soldiers and says that the battalion is going to become a father. They will adopt the 3 children, and all the soldiers erupt in a cheer. Not long after that, the battalion is engaged in a deadly battle. The mother is shot, and the children are taken hostage by the enemy. In jumping ahead, I'm bypassing some of the most epic moments in the history of world literature. Epic in terms of dramatic action and of the values at stake. If you've read the book, you know. If you haven't, you must. But right now, my focus is on Radub. The children's captors are besieged in a tower called the Torg. They are 19 men, surrounded by an army of 4,500. Given how badly outnumbered they are, they decide to bargain with the children's lives. The children are held in a library full of books. On the floor below, the soldiers have placed barrels of tar. The floor above is filled with straw. They tell the Republican soldiers that if they are allowed to go free, the children will live. If they are attacked, they will light a fuse, and the children will die. When all efforts to rescue the children fail, the general in command reluctantly decides that the battle must begin. The only point of attack on the castle is through a dark, narrow, toothed, winding breach that was blown in the side of the tower with gunpowder. On the other side of the breach, inside the tower, the 19 men are well barricaded, well armed, and ready to kill. Radub, knowing this well, approaches his commanding officer to say that he and the men of his battalion have a favor to ask. The favor? To be first into the breach. Here's the passage from 93. "Think about it, sir. This is a good chance. There's going to be some hard fighting. The Torg will burn the fingers of those who touch it. We're asking the favor of being among them." The sergeant paused, twisted his mustache, then went on in a faltering voice. "And then, sir, our children are in that tower. The children of the battalion are there, our 3 children. No matter what happens, we won't let them be hurt. Do you hear that, sir? We won't have it. Sir, if anything happens to one hair on their angelic heads, I swear by everything that's sacred that I, Sergeant Radub, will get even with the Heavenly Father for it." He's granted the favor. When they find that the enemy is too well guarded behind the red raid, the general asks for a volunteer to scale it. Sergeant Radub emerges from the group and says, "I will." In the hand-to-hand combat that ensues, an enemy soldier thrusts a saber in Radub's shoulder. He ignores it. Radub's ear is shot off. He laughs, saying that an ear is only an ornament. He kills a handful of the 19 men, but the rest are able to make a retreat up to the next floor, where they barricade and arm themselves anew. Radub asks the general if he might have a reward for his bravery, to be first up the stairs. I think every human being's education ought to include Radub, and I make sure that for my students, it does. This combination of epic ferocity and paternal tenderness doesn't have its like in any other work of literature I know, except maybe one, also by Hugo. It was characters like Radub who prompted my student to declare herself a terrible person and to aspire to more. Bloom lamented that with the loss of reading, his students' longing for the beyond had been attenuated. That of mine, thankfully, has not. This is Hugo again. So, like that grieving mother kneeling in worship before a little pink shoe, we have images equivalently evocative, in this case of courage and compassion. The pearl-like tear on that bristling mustache, a soldier asking the favor of being first into the breach and then laughing in battle. A man vowing that if anything happens to one hair on the children's angelic heads, he'll get even with God. I've heard it said by cynics that reading stories of heroes like this is escapism from the real world, where no such men exist. But I couldn't disagree more. First, reading stories like this helps make it possible for such men to exist, because it is such works that inspire, in Bloom's words, the soul's longing and offers them images of the ideal. As a quick aside, I recently went on a fraud kick, listening to podcasts and watching movies with stories of deception. Stories like Theranos and Fire Festival, for those who know about them. What interested me most about these stories was not so much the deceivers as the enablers, those who knew what was happening and turned a blind eye. They were rife with excuses. They feared retribution, their paychecks were on the line, they couldn't be completely sure. And every time, I wondered whether they had ever known characters like Radub, who, to defend what was sacred, asked the favor of putting his life on the line. And besides, men like Radub do exist. And having conceptualized men like Radub helps us to recognize that. I'm sure everyone here has their favorite stories of this sort of heroic bravery from the annals of real-life history. I recommend taking a moment right now to think of yours. Write it down, draw a heart around it. I approve of that kind of doodling. They don't exist, to be sure, in the perfectly stylized version of a literary hero. Our real-life heroes do ordinary things. They brush their teeth, I guess, depending on what period of history we're talking about. But in abstracted essence, focusing on what matters, they do exist. Further, men like Radub exist all around us, even in this room. Maybe it's you. Many of us face circumstances in which we have to take great risks and face great dangers to defend our values. And to the extent that we do, we are like Radub. And connecting our small moments of bravery to its essence in him helps them to take on that special glow. Literature presents an endless variety of heroes, exemplifying an endless array of virtues, models of what we might strive for and who we might be. To illustrate the astounding variety in the inspirations available to us, I will now describe one other hero, utterly different from the strong, compassionate, dauntless soldier Radub, the shriveled, antisocial, bacteriology professor, Max Gottlieb. Dr. Gottlieb can be discovered among the pages of a novel by Sinclair Lewis called Aerosmith. It's the story of Martin Aerosmith, a medical student torn between two seemingly irreconcilable paths, that of practical success or that of pure science. Again and again, Martin finds himself up against this choice. Will he go after money, fame, promotions, and all the other varieties of commercial success? Or will he maintain a pure, cold-hearted, self-abnegating, spiritual sort of devotion to scientific truth? Whether or not you or I accept this dichotomy, it exists in the universe of this novel, because it exists in the judgment of Sinclair Lewis. And whether or not you or I agree with that judgment, in the course of embroidering his theme, Lewis does lay bare many unarguable truths, and he does prompt us to consider many vitally important questions. In Aerosmith, when Martin arrives at the University of Winnemac, he has heard whisperings about Professor Gottlieb, the dark, aloof bacteriology researcher who lives in his lab and scorns success, and he's captivated by him. Martin hangs around the main medical building, hoping to catch a glimpse of his elusive hero. And though, when Gottlieb finally appears, he is in the threadbare topcoat of an old professor, Martin remembers him forever as wrapped in a black velvet cape with a silver star arrogant on his breast. When Martin finally makes his way to Gottlieb's office, he finds not a cloaked horseman, but a testy, wrinkled, middle-aged man, and he worships him. This is the face of a very different sort of hero, a purist devoted above all else to scientific precision and the pursuit of truth. It is from Gottlieb that Martin learns what becomes to his lab mates an irksome refrain: control, control, control. Where's your control? It is Gottlieb who inspires in him the restless doubtings of the devotee of pure research. It is Gottlieb who, whenever Martin feels caught by the lure of lowbrow commercialism, is there like the angel on his shoulder, reminding him of the sacredness in science. When Martin's lab partner, nicknamed the Reverend because of his sanctimoniousness and his ambition to be a medical missionary, criticizes Gottlieb for his lack of faith, Martin retorts, "You think Gottlieb isn't religious, Hinckley? Why, his just being in a lab is a prayer." Might remind you of a line from The Fountainhead. Martin's devotion to the Gottlieb gospel is put to its greatest test by love. He falls madly in love with the madly lovable Leora, who's reason enough on her own to read this novel. If he wants to marry her, he has to be able to support her, and this means abandoning the lab for a commercial practice. I've been doing okay with my cold, but bear with me. But that reverential spirit is still inside him, and, quote, he was homesick for the laboratory, for the thrill of uncharted discoveries, the quest below the surface and beyond the moment, the search for fundamental laws which the scientist exalts above temporary healing as the religious exalts the nature and terrible glory of God above pleasant daily virtues. It is a painful gift of the Magi sort of irony that Martin must abandon that spirit for his love of Leora, when it is precisely that spirit in him that Leora loves. In fact, when Leora meets Gottlieb, the pure embodiment of scientific zealotry, she declares of this testy, wrinkled, middle-aged man, "There's the first man I ever laid eyes on that I'd leave you for if he wanted me. He's like a sword. No, he's like a brain walking. Oh, Sandy, he looked so wretched, I wanted to cry. I'd black his shoes." I know of at least one person who, after reading Aerosmith, has adopted that last expression, even though it brings perplexed looks every time she uses it. So I say we work together to make part of the common parlance the compliment, "I'd black his shoes." Someone use it with me this week. This novel centers around Martin's efforts to reconcile the concerns of practicality with Gottlieb's spiritual devotion to science, captured memorably and famously in the prayer of the scientist. It goes like this, quote, God, give me unclouded eyes and freedom from haste. God, give me a quiet and relentless anger against all pretense and all pretentious work and all work left slack and unfinished. God, give me strength not to trust to God," unquote. We could all, scientists or not, benefit from summoning this prayer now and then. I know the enablers in my fraud stories sure could have. I've often heard it said that with great literature, we have the opportunity to transcend the barriers of our limited upbringing and to find our true home. Maybe you, given your own personal struggles and ambitions, relate more to Radub. Or maybe you identify more closely with Max Gottlieb. In literature, we can find our own problems and solutions to them writ large. In this array of characters, we find those who speak to us. But I think still much more important is the fact that we discover those who change us. Rather than just seeing our own values reflected, we find our values reformed. In his book, Why Read?, literature professor Mark Edmondson says, quote, "Real reading is reincarnation. There's no other way to put it. It is being born again into a higher form of consciousness than we ourselves possess," unquote. And on a recent panel discussion, in a moment that helped inspire this talk, Douglas Murray said, "Art tells us you should change your life. You must change your life." Last summer, at my school's open house, I spoke to the parents of a student just transferring into VanDamme Academy as an 8th grader. They told me she hates reading. And they said, very skeptically, that if I could get her to enjoy it, they'd be impressed. I told them that if I couldn't get her to enjoy it, I would retire. Perhaps that sounds boastful, and perhaps it is a little. But what I really meant to express is how strongly I believed in the infallible power of literature to inspire her, if only she were exposed to it. Just a few weeks ago, that same student wrote in my yearbook, in all caps at the start, "I like reading. The variety of books you expose me to has widened my outlook. I am noticing more about the world, and I credit that to," all caps again, "reading." In a simple phrase, this novice reader captured my lecture's whole theme. Reading great books widens our outlook and prompts us to notice. We learn what gives life meaning, and we learn to see that meaning reflected in a moment. Though it isn't the theme of my lecture, I want to take a moment to make a related pedagogical point. I share with many advocates of education reform a commitment to the sanctity of the individual, to free thought, and to the right of self-actualization. But I differ with many of them on the issue of whether these commitments mean that a child's education ought to be self-directed. Most of us recall with dread the hours of tedium we spent bound to a desk and filling out mindless worksheets. And the idea of an educational environment in which we choose our own paths and focus on our own interests seems like a blissful utopia by contrast. But I believe very strongly that a canon of great literature taught by a passionate and expert authority with the goal of widening a student's outlook and helping them to develop the habit of noticing is non-optional to a proper education. Left in a room with all the materials they need and the freedom to tinker and explore, a classroom of kids never exposed to one would be hard-pressed to recreate the wheel. And if we do not take them by the hand and guide them through great works of literature, we're asking them to recreate something that is the legacy of centuries of genius, the spiritual microscope. I consider myself a successful literature teacher, but when it comes down to it, I deserve so little credit for the impact that my teaching has. I'm no more than a talented tour guide through the sacred monuments built by Hugo, Ibsen, Dostoevsky, Maupassant, Rostand, Tolstoy, and Ayn Rand. If we want our children to be equipped with the knowledge and skills that will allow them to lead lives carefully examined and deeply fulfilled, we must take them on these tours, as many as possible, and show them life's possibilities. Now, a full education means that we have glimpsed both the best among those possibilities and the very worst. Just as our book-deprived students lack models of virtue, they also lack models of vice and cruelty and suffering and evil. In The Closing of the American Mind, Alan Bloom tells how he began asking his college freshmen, "Who do you think is evil?" The answer came in chorus, and it's one that I'm sure I can recreate here. Who do you think they named as evil? Louder? No, in the 80s. It's not as strong a chorus as I expected it to be, but I heard a few. Hitler was the almost unanimous response. Since Bloom was asking this question of American college students in the 70s or the 80s, can anyone guess who was a close second? Nixon. And today, we can probably guess what that would be. Even just the juxtaposition of those two names betrays a problem far more serious than the fact that Hitler is the only example they can summon. Much graver still is the fact that, as Bloom puts it, Hitler is just another abstraction, an item to fill up an empty category. The horrors of the Nazi regime are not real to them. Their intellectual understanding is shallow, and their moral feeling muted. As evidence that this is equally, if not more, true today, I offer the frequency with which the accusation that someone is a Nazi, or like Hitler, is casually thrown around in our current political discourse. No one could do that so cavalierly who had a meaningful understanding of the full force of those terms. The consequence of this utter ignorance of real evil, Bloom says, is that, quote, the most common student view lacks an awareness of the depths as well as the heights, and hence lacks gravity, unquote. This point is one that was made poignantly real to me in a speech you've probably heard me mention before, since it's one I regard as life-changing and that I profess as mandatory viewing for all. Socialism's Legacy by free speech advocate, anti-communist scholar, and retired UPenn professor, Alan Charles Kors. Kors's theme in Socialism's Legacy is essentially this. Even after the fall of the Berlin Wall, intellectuals continue to adamantly disavow the connection between socialism in theory and the unimaginably evil communist regimes in practice. And at the same time, they loudly decry the faults of our society, one that in practice has, quote, raised human beings to a dignified, free life, protected as never before from helplessness before nature and men, unquote. In his lecture, Kors declares our society guilty of a scandal of ignorance. Our children, he says simply, do not know about the bodies. They do not know. Ask college freshmen, Kors says, how many died under communism, and they'll answer, thousands, tens of thousands. Victim of a very conventional American education myself, which I've spent the rest of my life trying to redeem, I had to acknowledge when he made this point in the lecture that I didn't know the answer either. I'm going to guess some of you don't. Scholars with access to the Soviet archives say a reasonable estimate is that 60 million people were slain in the Soviet Union alone. If one were to add up all those starved, worked to death, and murdered under all the communist regimes taken together, he says, most scholars put a reasonable estimate at a total exceeding 100 million, or even 200 million. Cors's words have haunted me ever since. Quote, "No cause ever in the history of all mankind has produced more slaughtered innocents and more orphans than socialism with power. It surpassed exponentially all other systems of production in turning out the dead. They're all around us. No one talks about them. No one honors them. No one does penitence for them. No one has committed suicide for having been an apologist for those who did this to them. No one pays for them. No one is hunted down to account for them." Unquote. This travesty, this scandal of ignorance, can only be redeemed by education. A meaningful education demands that we teach this history and the connection to its underlying political philosophy. Alan Kors puts it emphatically when he says, "I don't know how education can be moral if it ignores one of the two great holocausts and sufferings of the 20th century." But why do I mention all this here? It's because a proper education in such horrors also crucially involves the deep feeling that is aroused by the concretization of ideas in art. One problem, as Kors points out, is, quote, "The communist Holocaust should have brought forth a flowering of Western art and witness and sympathy. It should have called forth an Atlantic Ocean of tears. Instead, it has called forth a glacier of indifference," unquote. But we have some available to us in translation from people who lived it, like Solzhenitsyn's The Gulag Archipelago, or Varlan Shalamov's Kolyma Tales. They are essential to making the abstractions visceral. Kors, as always, puts the point beautifully. Quote, "Reading literature is indispensable to understanding those atrocities because it transforms abstractions and statistics into a shared human experience and a shared human comprehension," unquote. That is the unique power of great art. Kors closes socialism's legacy with a quote from such a work of art. He says, "Let the apologists for communism acknowledge the dead, bury the dead, and atone for the dead. Let Western intellectuals learn the words of Requiem, the great poem written during the Stalinist terror by Anna Akhmatova, the greatest Russian poet of the 20th century. I will remember them always and everywhere. I will never forget them, no matter what comes." I heeded his call and learned the words of Requiem, and I'm going to share some of them with you now. First, a word about their author. Anna Akhmatova lived through the reign of Stalin, during which she saw her work banned, her husband killed, and her son imprisoned for a total of 15 years. If you attended my love poetry course last summer, you may recognize the name. She's that woman who spent a blissful night rhapsodizing over literature and falling in love with intellectual historian Isaiah Berlin. When her son was in prison, Akhmatova spent 300 hours at the prison gates, among mostly women, gray with exhaustion and the horror of their relatives' arrests, their legs swollen and aching with the long hours of standing, Some carrying packages they hoped to get to their husbands, brothers, or sons, others just wanting to learn where their men were and how long their sentences would be. In the preface to Requiem, the poem quoted by Kors, Akhmatova explains why she set herself the task of recording the sufferings of those people, as only she, an artist, could. This preface is itself a priceless work of art. She says, quote, "In the fearful years of the Yezhov terror, I spent 17 months in prison queues in Leningrad. One day, someone identified me. Beside me, in the queue, there was a woman with blue lips. She had, of course, never heard of me, but she suddenly came out of that trance so common to us all and whispered in my ear. Everybody spoke in whispers there. Can you describe this?" And I said, "Yes, I can." And then something like the shadow of a smile crossed what had once been her face. Unquote. The woman's blue lips on what had once been a face, but I imagine now must only be a mask of suffering. The trance-like state of existence common to them all, the whispered desperation that their stories be heard, and the shadow of a smile, the most she can summon at the thought that they might be. It's the subtleties of this description that turn the abstraction of waiting in a prison line into a reality that rends our hearts. It is in the poem's epilogue that we hear the ache of Akhmatova's longing to make the voices of all those sufferers heard and remembered. And I'm going to read that to you now. Again, the hands of the clock are nearing the unforgettable hour. I see, hear, touch all of you. The cripple they had to support painfully to the end of the line, the moribund, and the girl who would shake her beautiful head and say, "I come here," as if it were home. I should like to call you all by name, but they have lost the lists. I have woven for them a great shroud out of the poor words I overheard them speak. I remember them always and everywhere. And if they shut my tormented mouth, through which 100 million of my people cry, let them remember me also. And if in this country they should want to build me a monument, I consent to that honor, but only on condition that they erect it not on the seashore where I was born. My last links there were broken long ago, nor by the stump in the royal gardens where an inconsolable young shade is seeking me, but here, where I stood for 300 hours and where they never opened the doors for me. Lest in blessed death, I should forget the grinding scream of the Black Mariahs, the hideous clanging gate, the old woman wailing like a beast. And may the melting snow drop like tears from my motionless bronze eyelids, and the prison pigeons coo above me, and the ships sail slowly down the Neva. Kors implores us to read Akhmatova's tribute to these unrecognized and unremembered souls, because if we do, we understand and we never forget. We are changed by it. It leaves echoes in our souls. The abstraction of their wretchedness is made intensely powerful with images of the woman standing at a prison gate, as if it were home. Or of the voices of 100 million victims crying through a poet's tormented mouth, or of a statue standing in mute witness to the people's suffering, melting snow from bronze eyelids dropping year after year like tears. I had heard Korz's lecture. I knew the horrors. But when I sat alone in my room and read this poem, I sobbed. How does reading literature like this relate to the quest for a meaningful life? The first reason is captured well in Bloom's simple phrase that one who is ignorant of the extremes of virtue and vice lacks gravity. To live a life fulfilled, we must be capable of a depth of moral feeling. And a depth of moral feeling comes of having formed substantive values and of being able to see the connection of our values to our immediate worlds. I'm sorry, I'm going to be sniffling. I knew between my cold and my emotion, this was going to be impossible. Thank you. Okay, thanks for the encouragement. Art is instrumental to that purpose. The way in which art takes abstractions and incarnates them in a pointed, memorable, and emotionally stirring form helps us to grapple with the abstract in a very personal way. And it takes a great artist to articulate and to memorialize those experiences. There's a reason that that poor woman at the gate looked at Akhmatova and said, "Can you describe this?" She felt it, she knew it, but she couldn't have described it. Only the poet could. Also, in our individual quests for meaning, each of us needs moral calibration. We need to learn and to remember and to focus on what matters most. I sometimes complain that ours has become a society of moral nitpickers, who have the time, the luxury, and the freedom to argue over trivialities and no deep understanding of or reverence for the fundamentals on which time and luxury and freedom depend. Literature can offer us stirring reminders of that which is fundamental to our happiness. Reading about great evils and terrible suffering is essential to this calibration. As Korz says in his lecture, when we bear witness to these horrors, we weep and we rededicate our humanity. Deeply understanding the conditions under which man has been cruelly denied the chance for a meaningful life helps us to understand what makes that meaning possible and stirs us to preserve that opportunity both culturally and within our own individual souls. And further, because art has the power to change us individually, it has the power to change the world. In his acceptance speech to the Swedish Academy for the Nobel Prize in Literature, Solzhenitsyn said, quote, "The simple act of an ordinary brave man is not to participate in lies, not to support false actions. His rule, let that come into the world. Let it even reign supreme, only not through me." But it is within the power of writers and artists to do much more, to defeat the lie. For in the struggle with lies, art has always triumphed and shall always triumph, visibly, irrefutably for all. Lies prevail against much in this world, but never against art, unquote. Literature prompts us to look beneath the surface of our experiences and to discover their spiritual significance. It offers us a pantheon of heroes after whom we can fashion our own souls. It brings us to great heights and to terrible depths, expanding our moral horizons and giving us gravity. It also helps us to observe and to relish every fiber in the fabric of human experience. In my poetry lecture last summer, I mentioned what I found to be a very illuminating passage by Vladimir Nabokov from an essay on Tolstoy's Anna Karenina. In the essay, Nabokov shares liberally from a scene depicting the birth of a loving couple's first child, which reveals the experience in all its drama, mystery, terror, beauty, and bliss. Nabokov then says the following, quote, "Mark incidentally that the whole history of literary fiction as an evolutionary process may be said to be a gradual probing of deeper and deeper layers of life. The artist, like the scientist, is always casting around, understanding a little more than his predecessor, penetrating further with a keener and a more brilliant eye. And this," the childbirth scene, "is the artistic result," unquote. We all understand, at least I hope we do in spite of American science education, the evolutionary process in a field like physics, in which great new discoveries depend crucially on those that came before, and an understanding is built layer upon painstaking layer, each one letting us see a little farther and a little more than we did before. We are aware of the giants on whose shoulders Newton stood, and of those who stood on his. But I think we are culturally less conscious of the fact that art, too, has undergone a similar evolution. And, more important, that it facilitates that evolution within each of us individually. Artists help us to probe to deeper and deeper layers of life, to cast around, to understand more, and to see with a keener and more brilliant eye. I shared Nabokov's point about evolution in literature in my poetry lecture last year. But what I didn't have the chance to share was the childbirth scene itself. I'm delighted that I can do so here. Before I do, let me give you a glimpse of the love between these two characters, Kitty and Levin, about to face the drama, mystery, terror, beauty, and bliss of the birth of their first child. There's a scene earlier in the novel, long before the two were betrothed, when Levin encounters Kitty at a skating ground in the zoological gardens. In my copy of the novel, this passage is underlined and highlighted and surrounded with little hearts and stars. I do that. Quote, "He knew she was there by the rapture and the terror that seized on his heart. She was standing, talking to a lady at the opposite end of the ground. There was apparently nothing striking either in her dress or her attitude. But for Levin, she was as easy to find in that crowd as a rose among nettles. Everything was made bright by her. She was the smile that shed light on all around her. Is it possible I can go over there on the ice, go up to her?" he thought. The place where she stood seemed to him a holy shrine, unapproachable, and there was one moment when he was almost retreating, so overwhelmed was he with terror. He had to make an effort to master himself and to remind himself that people of all sorts were moving about her, and that he too might come there to skate. He walked down, for a long while avoiding looking at her as at the sun, but seeing her as one does the sun without looking," unquote. If Hugo laid bare the essence of maternity in the story of Paquette, Tolstoy here has shown us the soul of infatuated love. Levin finding her as easily as a rose among nettles, fearing to approach her as if she were a holy shrine, and avoiding looking at her like the sun, but seeing her as one does the sun without looking. In my mind, that single selection makes a masterpiece of this 1,000-page work. But there's so much more, not the least of which is the scene of childbirth. I have to excerpt it for constraints of time, but it pains me to do so. Again, sit back, get comfortable, and allow me just a few minutes to transport you to another world and to a very stirring moment. There had been a period of repose, and Levin had sunk into oblivion. He had completely forgotten what was going on now. Suddenly, there came an unearthly shriek. Levin jumped up, ran on tiptoe to the bedroom, and took up his position at Kitty's pillow. Kitty's swollen and agonized face, a tress of hair clinging to her moist brow, was turned to him and sought his eyes. Her lifted hands asked for his hands. Clutching his chill hands in her moist ones, she began squeezing them to her face. Don't go, don't go. I'm not afraid, she said rapidly. Mama, take my earrings, they bother me. You're not afraid? Quick, Lizaveta Petrovna. She spoke quickly, very quickly, and tried to smile. But suddenly, her face was drawn. She pushed him away. Oh, this is awful. I'm dying. Go away, she shrieked. And again, he heard that unearthly scream. Levin clutched at his head and ran out of the room. It's nothing. It's all right, Dolly called after him. But they might say what they liked. He knew that all was over. He stood in the next room, his head leaning against the doorpost, and heard shrieks, howls such as he had never heard before. And he knew that what had been Kitty was uttering those shrieks. He had long ago ceased to wish for the child. By now, he loathed this child. He did not even wish for her life now. All he longed for was the end of this awful anguish. Doctor, what is it? What is it, by God? He said, snatching at the doctor's hand as he came up. It's the end, said the doctor. And the doctor's face was so grave as he said it that Levin took the end as meaning her death. Beside himself, he ran into the bedroom. In the place where Kitty's face had been was something that was fearful in its strained distortion and in the sounds that came from it. He fell down with his head on the wooden framework of the bed, feeling that his heart was bursting. The awful scream never paused. It became still more awful, and as though it had reached the utmost limit of terror, suddenly it ceased. Levin could not believe his ears, but there could be no doubt. The scream had ceased, and he heard a subdued stir and bustle and hurried breathing, and her voice, gasping, alive, tender, and blissful, uttered softly, "It's over." He lifted his head. With her hands hanging exhausted on the quilt, looking extraordinarily lovely and serene, she looked at him in silence and tried to smile and could not. Falling on his knees before the bed, he held his wife's hand before his lips and kissed it, and the hand, with a weak movement of the fingers, responded to his kiss. And meanwhile, there at the foot of the bed, in the deft hands of Lizaveta Petrovna, like a flickering light in a lamp, lay the life of a human creature, which had never existed before, and which would now, with the same right, with the same importance to itself, live and create in its own image. Alive, and a boy too. Set your mind at rest, Levin heard Lizaveta Petrovna saying as she slapped the baby's back with a shaking hand. Mama, is it true? Said Kitty's voice. The princess's sobs were all the answer she could make. And in the midst of the silence, there came an unmistakable reply to the mother's question, a voice quite unlike the subdued voices speaking in the room. It was the bold, clamorous, self-assertive squall of the new human being who had so incomprehensibly appeared. I've often said that the births of my 4 children were the 4 most concentrated moments of bliss of my entire life. But how can such an experience be described? How can one do justice to it? How is it possible to put that awe-inspiring drama into words? I couldn't, but Tolstoy did. From the tress of hair clinging to her moist brow, to the chill of his hands against her face, to her anguished screams and the feeling that his heart would burst, to that subdued stir and bustle, to the clamorous and self-assertive squall of new life, Tolstoy made this scene palpably real. But it is real with a heightened reality that highlights and underscores everything that makes childbirth an experience of intense drama and unrepeatable bliss. Kitty's rapid swing from "I'm not afraid" to "I'm dying." Probably some of us have said that. Levin's adorably naive and despairing conviction that his wife really will die. His helpless terror so great that he no longer wants the child, but only wants Kitty to be spared her suffering. The scream that reaches the very limit of terror and suddenly ceases. And then, incomprehensibly, that flickering new life that had never existed before. Great literature makes us deeply self-aware about our experiences by conceptualizing them and communicating them in a distilled and dramatic form. To women everywhere who have given birth to a child and could never find the words to describe it, Tolstoy has said, "I can." In the words of writer Elizabeth Drew, great authors, quote, "find the right words in the right order for what we already dimly and dumbly feel. And they also fertilize in our consciousness responses which were lying inert and cloddish," unquote. This is only a single example among an endless number of others I might have selected. What Tolstoy has done here for childbirth, novelists have done for virtually every experience available to man. The more of them we know, the more our lives are characterized by that heightened perceptiveness and that enriched self-awareness. In Why Read, Edmondson put it perfectly. Reading great literature allows us to see the world, quote, "through the eyes of people who, let us admit it, are more sensitive, more articulate, shrewder, sharper, more alive than we ourselves are. The experience of merging minds and hearts with Proust or James or Austen makes you see that there is more to the world than you ever imagined. You see that life is bigger, sweeter, more tragic and intense, more alive with meaning than you had thought," unquote. There's a concept in psychology today called mindfulness. Many of us often have anxious thoughts continually running through our heads, distracting us from the moment at hand. And mindfulness asks us to lay aside ruminating, problem-solving, strategizing, and connect with the present moment, to be conscious of what we are actually feeling and seeing and experiencing right now. I've co-opted that term for my purposes. I like to say that reading great literature gives us meaning mindfulness. We develop a capacity for awareness of the present moment, but a higher order awareness. We develop a capacity to know what matters, to recognize the significance behind our experiences, and to see the connection of everyday life to our most fundamental values. There's so much more that could be said about the power of literature and that I will be saying for the rest of my life. How art can penetrate to all the deepest recesses of the human soul and shed light on truths about ourselves or others that were previously hidden from view. How it can transport us to new worlds that break us of our provincialism and challenge our unanalyzed principles, providing us with options of who we want to be and how we want to live. How it can give us models of countless human types, good and bad, against whom we measure the people we meet and even ourselves. how it allows us to commune with minds far more brilliant, thoughtful, and observant than anyone we might meet in the ordinary course of our lives, and how it can create worlds whose sense of life corresponds completely to our own, and in which we feel entirely and refreshingly at home. But what I want to leave you with more than anything is this. In the closing of The American Mind, Alan Bloom says that though the Bible may not be the only means to furnish a mind with deep moral questions, quote, without a book of similar gravity, read with the gravity of the potential believer, it will remain unfurnished, unquote. That's what I'm here today to advise, that in your own pursuit of a life of meaning, you read great books, and with the gravity of the potential believer. Great novelists prompt us to consider deep spiritual questions with the sort of reverence often reserved for religion. The treasury of great literature available to us can be our Bible, not in the sense that it delivers moral commandments, but in that it inspires us to contemplate in an intense, thoughtful, personal, and emotional way the things that matter most. This is why I've often referred to myself as an evangelist for literature. At one point when I was preparing this talk, my now 7-year-old son heard me express uncertainty as to how to end it. He said, "You know how a lot of stories end?" And I said, "How?" He said, "They lived happily ever after." So I will follow his advice and end by saying, live meaningfully ever after. Read great books. Thank you very much. Thank you so much, and I apologize for not leaving a tremendous amount of time for questions. And thank you, 10 minutes to be precise. I probably shouldn't talk between now and my Keats talk, which is at 1:50 today in this room. But I will be around for the next few days, so what I don't have time to answer right now, please feel free to stop me. After the Keats talk, it's okay, I can lose my voice. There's no, you can talk to me as much as you want. Yeah, hi.
Hi. Can you give a couple of examples of essential ways that you think that the public schools are teaching literature in the wrong way?
Now I'm going to preface anything I say by saying I'm not an expert in what the public schools currently are doing. I have lived a life blissfully removed from the educational establishment. I was going to get a master's in education and left for my first teaching job. So I have a bachelor's degree in philosophy and actually no specific training in education. I got on-the-job training. And I also don't, as some of you probably know, venture much into education policy. I like to write about how I approach things at my school or how I approach teaching literature, but I don't want to speak to what I don't really know. I can tell you from my experience as a public school educated student, and I know it's an approach that has resonated with most people when I talk to them. I think it was Leonard Peikoff, actually, that when I first, in one of my early conversations with Leonard Peikoff, I'm having a hard time. Sorry. He asked me what I'd read in school, and I wrote down a list, and I said, and I handed it to him, and he said, okay, that takes care of America. What about the rest of the world? And I realized I had only read the kind of stock list of American classics, Catcher in the Rye, East of Eden, what's the green light at the end of the dock? I don't know why I'm blanking on that right now. So, Gatsby. I had in my schooling, almost no exposure to great classic world literature. To the extent that I did, it was taught in a very didactic form. It was taught maybe primarily to make me culturally literate, or reading literate, to give me an expanded vocabulary, to make me aware of the plots of this so that I would be familiar with them in the world, but not to get the sort of value that I described here, a spiritual value of shaping your outlook on the world and making you more attuned to values in the course of your everyday existence. I just don't think almost anyone outside of the world of objectivist literary scholars approaches literature in that way. I have to say quickly, too, that my awakening to the power of literature was Leonard Peikoff's eight great plays. It was 7 great plays when I saw it at the conference, the first conference I ever attended as a 20-year-old. Very fortuitous experience, but I highly recommend that everybody take that course. So the didactic approach as to the mining spiritual value approach, I think, is the essential. And then also the fact today that, first of all, very few novels are taught at all in the public schools, as far as I know. There's a real push to make the list of titles politically correct, as opposed to the true canon of classics that have shaped Western thought. So those are a few of the other differences, too.
Thanks.
Hi. For Alan Bloom's article, Our Listless Universities, he talks about how young people, at least in his time, moved to music as their form of literature, because literature was horrible to them. They hated reading, and they went to music, and their souls were animated. But it was something what he would call hedonism, but nevertheless, they were animated by the music. So what part of literature, music animates the soul, even if it's bad ideas like hedonism in rock music during his time?
I want to make sure I understand the question. So are you asking me the question about music? Because I'm not the one to ask about music. So how music has that effect on? Yeah, there are a few people here giving lectures on music, and they'd be much better able to speak to that question than I would.
Thank you.
I wish I knew the answer. I do want to say one quick thing. Sorry, Harry, I promise I'll get to you. Yesterday, you heard Greg Salmieri saying, don't have, the obligation to read literature, great literature, hang as some commandment over your head and make you judge yourself negatively for failing to fulfill it. And I'm conscious that I essentially ended my lecture with a commandment. I think the last 3 words were, read great books. And I don't think those are at odds, and I'm going to guess, but I won't speak for him, that he wouldn't think they are either. Because I have profound sympathy for people not wanting to read, given their experience in their reading education to the extent that they had one. It's not an easy and obvious skill. So if you just pick up Crime and Punishment off the shelf right now, it will be difficult for you to get the value, and you have no experience reading great literature. It would be very difficult to get the value out of it. So that's actually I was just telling my husband and daughter last night at dinner that I've realized more and more that I believe my vocation in life is to build a bridge from people's present state, given that they were not given a proper education in literature, to the ability to enjoy it now, essentially a shortcut, because this should have been something that you experienced and were guided through and shown the value of in the many, many hours you spent in your elementary and high school education and college education, but it's simply not. And so since those hours were squandered, there has to be a shortcut way. So my shortcut way, quick sales pitch, although it's free, so it's not really a sales pitch, is I have an app called Read With Me. I'm sure some of you know about it, just in case there's anyone. You can find it at the website readwithmebookgroup.com. readwithmebookgroup.com, and you can download the app from there. And I have a growing catalog of books that I read to you chapter by chapter, and at the end of a chapter or two, I give a brief summary of those chapters from my perspective of what's important about them, and then a short 10, 15-minute commentary on what's valuable about them. It's very easily consumable, and judging by things people have told me here, it doesn't feel like a duty. It doesn't feel like a labored effort, maybe a little bit with Crime and Punishment. But I think it has my goal, and if you come to the Keats talk, you'll see me attempt this in practice again, is to make the profound values available in great literature more directly and easily accessible. Harry.
Unfortunately, I don't paint, but I know something of words. What color are your boots? I would gladly blacken them. Thank you.
Thanks, Harry.
Ocon is a very expensive event, and that hour and a half just now, that made it worth my while.
Thank
Absolutely.
you.
That was hands down the best lecture I've ever been to in my life.
That's very kind.
Question is, as the cornucopia of wisdom, are you writing a book? Or have you considered writing a book, or would the Read With Me app be the thing to go to?
Am I? No, considered in a sense. What I'm doing right now is being mom, partly, and devoting myself to producing the content of Read With Me. Now, as I produce that content steadily, so far, also, several of the books that I featured here are available in their entirety on Read With Me, and that was deliberate because if I enticed you, I wanted you then to have a place to go. Anna Karenina's not there yet, but Notre Dame de Paris, 93 is there, Aerosmith by Sinclair Lewis is there. So right now I'm just kind of slowly and steadily creating the content for that. I'm learning so much about how to appreciate literature, about specific works of literature. I had, in the past, as literature became more and more my passion, I considered, well, should I go get a PhD in literature? But I imagine there are people in this room who could tell me how valuable that experience is. I'm sure there's value in it, but I'm sure there's torture in it too. And this is my way of trying to give myself a PhD in literature. So I feel like once I spend many years creating that material, there's a lot of opportunity to do more that will come out of it. That's my hope. So writing a book about how to appreciate literature could be one thing.
Good.
Thank you. Okay, thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to subscribe and ring the bell to never miss a video.